My grandpa grabbed my wrist so hard it left a mark, yanked me through his front door before I could say hello, and hissed 4 words I still hear at 3 a.m. Hide. Right now. Go. Seconds later, I was crammed behind a hallway closet, listening to my own mom walk in with a stranger and a stack of papers thick enough to steal an old man's entire life. What I heard in the next 30 minutes turned my stomach inside out, and what I did about it ended with my mother screaming in front of 80 birthday balloons and half our hometown. I'm Melanie, this is Millhaven, Ohio, and welcome back to Silent Revenge, where the quietest people throw the hardest punches. If family betrayal and grandparents who are smarter than anyone gives them credit for is your thing, hit subscribe right now, this story earns it. Drop your city and the time where you're watching in the comments. Let's go back to the gray Tuesday that changed my whole family. I'm Melanie Carter, 32, a hospice nurse just outside Millhaven, Ohio. Before that October afternoon, I thought I understood my family. I thought my mom, Diane, was overbearing but well-meaning. I thought my grandpa, Earl Whitfield, was a sweet 80-year-old slowing down a little. I thought my stepdad, Roland, was harmless, maybe a little slick. I was wrong about almost all of it. I never called ahead with Grandpa Earl. I'd just swing by after my shift, let myself in with the spare key under the flower pot, and we'd sit on his porch while he told stories about the hardware store he ran on Main Street for 40 years. That man could add a lumber order faster than a calculator. Sharp as a tack my whole life. Remember that. That Tuesday, I pulled into his gravel driveway and he was already standing in the doorway, waiting like he'd been watching the road for an hour. He was white as a bedsheet. "Grandpa? You okay?" He didn't answer. He grabbed my sleeve, harder than I'd ever felt his grip, and pulled me inside. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, and that's when I heard tires on gravel. Car pulling in behind me. My mother's car. "Hide," he whispered, steering me toward the hallway. "Right now. Please, Melly." He hadn't called me that nickname since I was 9. That's what finally made my legs move. He shoved me into the narrow gap behind the old hallway closet, barely deep enough to fold myself into sideways, and the front door was already opening before I'd caught my breath. He did not look confused. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment for weeks. The gap smelled like mothballs and cedar. I pressed flat against the wall, my pulse pounding so loud in my own ears I was sure it would give me away. The front door opened. No knock. "Dad, it's just us," my mom's voice rang out, bright and sugar-sweet in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Don't get up." Footsteps, my mom's quick clip, Roland's slow shuffle, and a third set, sharp heels clicking across the hardwood my grandfather laid with his own hands. Couch groaned. I heard Grandpa, in a thin, wandering voice I didn't recognize, ask if anyone wanted tea. Nobody answered. A stranger's voice, crisp, rehearsed, the voice of someone who'd done this in a dozen living rooms, said something got set on the coffee table with a heavy, expensive thud. Papers. A whole stack. "We'll keep this simple, Earl. Just need a couple signatures." My mother made a soft, soothing sound. The one she used to make when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. The sound that used to mean safety. Now it made my skin crawl. Through the crack in the door I understood, in my gut before my brain caught up, that this wasn't a family visit. It was a heist. And my grandfather had known it was coming. I just had no idea yet how deep it went. My mom, Diane, is 56. My whole life she ran our family like a thermostat, warm and everyone relaxed, cold and we all scrambled to warm her back up. Peace in our house had a price, and I was almost always the one who paid it. I'm a hospice nurse. I know exactly what it looks like when a perfectly healthy older adult gets treated like they're already gone. I just never expected to see that look aimed at my own grandpa. Roland, my stepdad, 61, wore shoes he couldn't afford and talked about deals that never closed. I'd met him maybe 6 times since he married my mom a year earlier, and something about him felt off from day one. The woman with the heels I'd never seen before in my life. For 3 weeks before that Tuesday, small things had bothered me. Grandpa had stopped calling me on Sundays, a 15-year tradition, and a bank statement addressed to him had shown up forwarded to my mother's address. I called the bank myself to ask why. They said they couldn't discuss another person's account with me. I had no standing to even ask. I remember telling myself I was being paranoid. Families forward mail all the time. I wanted so badly to be wrong. Crouched in that closet, listening to a stranger tell my grandfather where to sign, I understood I hadn't been paranoid. I'd been early, and I'd let myself get talked out of trusting my own gut. If you've ever ignored that gut feeling about someone because you wanted to believe the best in them, drop a red flag below. The stranger, Vanessa Cole, I'd later learn, walked my grandpa through the papers in a flat, rehearsed voice. These papers, she explained, would let my mom handle things so Earl wouldn't have to worry. Financial power of attorney. Once signed, my mother could manage every account, every bill, every dollar he had. Roland spoke up next, soft in a way that made it worse. The house was too much for a man to keep up alone, he said. There was a lovely place over in Cedarbrook. Once the house sold, it would cover the best care money could buy. My grandfather made a small, lost sound and asked what would happen to his tomato garden. Nobody answered. My mom leaned in and dropped her voice to the tone she saves for hard truths. Dad, we've been over this. You forget things now. This is for your own good. Then she said the sentence I will hear until the day I die. He won't even remember by Christmas anyway. She said it the way you'd mention it might rain. Not cruel exactly. Worse than cruel. Certain. I bit down on my own knuckle to stay silent. Through the crack, I could see the edge of my grandfather's armchair, his hand resting on the armrest. Not shaking the way a frightened old man's hand shakes. Teddy. He had a pencil stub, and against the side of the chair, hidden from everyone but me, he was writing something small on a torn scrap of paper. My grandfather, the man they'd just declared too far gone to run his own life, was quietly taking notes. My heart was breaking, and something else in me was waking up at the exact same time. I didn't know it yet, but he wasn't the one who needed rescuing. He was running the trap. For the next several minutes, my grandfather put on an acting job that should have won an Oscar. He forgot Roland's name twice, calling him the fellow from the bank. He asked about his tomato garden 3 times, until my mother's patience frayed to a thread. Dad. Please, she snapped, and I heard the real Diane slip through, tight, impatient. Vanessa tried to guide the pen into his hand. He fumbled it, knocked it off the table, apologized in a small, confused voice. Roland let out the sigh of a man watching his payday take too long. They decided he was too tired to sign that day. My mom said they'd come back that weekend when he was having a better day. I could hear the disappointment sitting thick as smoke. Then, while they gathered their coats and Vanessa tucked the unsigned papers back into her leather case, my grandfather turned his head slowly toward the exact spot where I was hidden. For 1 second his eyes were not cloudy at all. They were sharp, clear, completely present. And they found me in the dark like he'd known exactly where I was the whole time. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Stay quiet. Wait. Then the fog rolled back over his face, and he asked no one in particular if it was almost time for supper. My hands would not stop shaking. My grandfather was not confused. He was pretending, and he was so good at it his own daughter believed every second. One question filled my chest. How long has he been acting? If you're new here, this is where the story really twists. Subscribe now, because the birthday party later is not something you want to catch halfway through. They left the unsigned papers for him to look over. My mom kissed his head and told him to rest. The front door clicked shut. Car started. Gravel crunched again. I counted to 60 in the dark, waiting to be sure. Then my grandfather's real voice came, low and steady. You can come on out now, Melly. I came out on legs that didn't want to hold me. He was by the window, watching the empty driveway, and when he turned he looked 10 years younger and completely exhausted at once. I asked what was going on. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like sawdust and explained it plain the way he explained everything. He'd suspected for months my mom and Roland were after the house. He'd started playing forgetful on purpose, so they'd let their guard down and show him the whole plan instead of one piece at a time. If I'd just told you your mother was doing this, you'd have found a reason to doubt me. You needed to hear it with your own ears. That's why he'd hidden me. Not panic, strategy. Then he pressed a scrap of paper into my hand, the one he'd been writing on the entire meeting. In his neat handwriting, a name and a number. "Start here," he said. "And Melly, your mother has a key to this house. She can walk back in any time." I sat at his kitchen table and made him walk me through it. The name was Margaret Kilbride, an elder law attorney who'd handled his affairs decades back. The number wasn't a phone number. It was a dollar amount. $21,400. That's what had gone missing in 3 months, spaced out carefully so no alarm would trip. When he'd called the bank, he learned a new authorized contact had quietly been added to help him, and the help was bleeding him dry. He'd stopped calling me on Sundays because my mom started dropping by unannounced on Sundays, and he didn't want her to see how close he and I still were. Everything I'd half noticed and talked myself out of clicked into one picture. Not a misunderstanding. Plan with a timeline. The house. The retirement. The little memorial fund in my late grandmother's name. And his dignity, which mattered to him more than any of it. He told me he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being erased while he was still breathing. I looked at the papers still on the coffee table. Pen left behind like a dare. I thought about my mother's voice. He won't even remember by Christmas anyway. "They are not getting this house," I said. He almost smiled. "Then we better hurry. She's got a key." Comment key if you've ever had to protect someone you love from the person who was supposed to protect them. I drove home with my hands locked on the wheel. My whole life I managed my mother by folding because folding was cheaper than the war. Now the war was here, and the old reflex kept whispering that staying quiet would keep things from getting worse. I knew better. I'd seen this exact story from the other side at work in family meetings around hospice beds. Staying quiet is exactly what these situations feed on. That night I couldn't sleep, so I researched, and what I found made my stomach drop. Adult children are the most common perpetrators of elder financial abuse in this country, not scammers overseas, their own kids. Nearly 4 in 10 reported cases involve an adult child draining a parent. An assigned power of attorney is brutally hard to undo. If my mom got that signature, she wouldn't even be breaking the law. She'd be operating fully inside it, with my grandfather's own name handing her the keys. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a legal pad, writing down every date, every dollar amount, the forwarded letter, the stranger with the leather case. Over-responsibility has always been my flaw, this need to carry weight that isn't mine. For once, it was finally pointed at the right target. By sunrise I had a plan, and it started with one phone call. Margaret Kilbride remembered my grandfather the second I said his name. Earl Whitfield. Sharpest man in Millhaven. "How's he holding up?" I told her the truth, and her warmth turned into something harder and more useful. 30 years in elder law, she'd watched this machine run before more times than she could count. She laid it out plainly. As long as he hadn't signed yet, we had a door propped open. But it was closing fast. To hold it, we needed 3 things: real proof of competency from a licensed doctor, documentation of every dollar already moved, and a formal report to Adult Protective Services. But Melanie, if they've got a signing scheduled this weekend, we're talking days, not weeks. Once he signs, we go from stopping a document to unwinding one. I asked what mattered most right now. "You're a nurse," she said. "Get him a real capacity evaluation from someone credible on the record." That's the wall they can't climb because their whole plan rests on one lie, that he's not competent. Prove that he is, and it collapses. I hung up with a to-do list and a countdown clock. Days, not weeks. And my mother still had a key. Here's where my job stopped being a job and started being a weapon, but not the kind my mother used. She dealt in warmth, switched on and off. In guilt, slid across a table alongside papers she'd told everyone he was too foggy to read. My weapons were different. She worked in manipulation. I worked in documentation. She wanted him declared incompetent behind closed doors. I was going to get him examined out in the open by a doctor whose signature meant something. I called Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a doctor who specializes in older patients, someone I'd worked with for 6 years and who never cut a corner in her life. I told her what I was seeing. She booked Earl for a full cognitive evaluation 2 days out. Not a favor, a real exam that would hold up anywhere. I told my grandpa the plan. He went quiet, then said, "Good. Let them say I'm gone. I'll take their little test and prove I'm right here." Her whole scheme leaned on one claim, that he couldn't understand what he was signing. If a doctor put it in writing that he did, her lie would have nowhere to stand. I wasn't going to scream at her. I was going to build a wall of facts so solid no amount of sweet talk could climb it. And that wall almost wasn't enough because 2 days later at the bank we found out just how far ahead of us they already were. My mother called the next morning, voice warm, the first warning sign since she only got that sweet when she wanted something. She told me Dad was slipping, that it broke her heart, that she and Roland just wanted to protect him from scams. The old me would have rushed to reassure her. I swallowed the reflex. "That's really sad, Mom," I said. Flat. Safe. No thread to pull. A small silence. Then, casual as anything, she brought up Grandpa's 80th birthday. "The whole family's coming. Neighbors, Pastor Dan, everybody. It'll be so lovely." Light words, heavy weight underneath. She was building an audience. Whatever she planned, she wanted it done in front of a crowd so it would look like blessing instead of robbery. I got off the phone before my voice could give me away. She wasn't targeting the weekend anymore. She'd moved to the birthday. She wanted witnesses. And that told me she was thinking carefully about how this would look. Wednesday, I drove Grandpa to the bank to switch his mailing address back and pull a full transaction printout. Simple, reasonable things a man is allowed to do with his own money. A young teller named Marcus got more uncomfortable by the minute. Grandpa asked why his statements had been going to his daughter's address. A change had been requested on his behalf. He asked who authorized Roland as a signer on his account. Marcus's ears went red. Turned out to be a limited authorization my mother had coaxed out of him weeks earlier under the guise of helping with bills. Notarized, cleared the bank's process. Technically all in order. There it is, the thing I keep trying to get people to understand. We did everything right and still hit a wall. Removing an authorized user, disputing withdrawals, all of it took time, process, and sometimes cooperation from both account holders, which was exactly the point. Then Marcus said the thing that turned my blood cold. Someone had already called ahead to tell the bank a power of attorney naming my mother was coming any day now, so they'd be ready to honor it the moment it landed. And signed, but every rail already laid. Grandpa hadn't signed anything. They weren't waiting on the bank anymore. They were waiting on him, at the party, surrounded by people who loved him. We got the printout, changed the address back, and I walked out understanding the trap wasn't a plan anymore. It was already half built. If you've made it this far, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us reach more families who need to hear it before it's too late. That night I went looking for the stranger in heels. Her name was Vanessa Cole, an elder care transition consultant, meaning whatever she needed it to mean. Not a lawyer, not a social worker. A notary running a side hustle, working on commissions, specializing in getting elderly people to sign fast before family could object. One review mentioned a client signed while medicated after surgery, an hour after Vanessa arrived. To Vanessa, my grandfather wasn't a person. He was a deal. My mom brought the trust. Roland brought the motive. Vanessa brought the machine that turned confusion, real or faked, into binding ink. Then I found the detail that made me put my laptop down and stare at the wall. Vanessa's booking calendar showed a block held open for the entire afternoon of my grandfather's birthday. No client name, just a private signing on a Saturday she'd otherwise marked off. Lined up exactly against the party my mother had just mentioned. They weren't just using the party as cover. They'd planned it down to the hour. Get him surrounded by cake and 80 balloons, feeling safe and loved, then produce the papers in front of everyone so when he signed, half the town would swear he'd done it happily. It was smart. It was patient. It was one of the coldest things I've ever seen. Thursday, I drove Grandpa to Dr. Nguyen's office and waited while she asked careful questions for 2 hours. Afterward, she told me plainly he was one of the sharpest 80-year-olds she'd examined in years. Fully oriented, excellent recall, sound judgment. She put it all in writing, dated and signed. Exactly the wall Margaret told me to build. But it was what he did in the car that I'll never forget. He reached into a canvas bag and set an old tin box on my lap, the kind that once held Christmas cookies, the lid gone soft with age. It had been my grandmother's. "It's time you had this," he said, and told me to open it at home alone and to read the letter first. His hands were steady. His voice was steady. But his eyes were shining. I held that box the whole ride, the cold metal through my sleeve, and it steadied me more than any legal document could. I now had a doctor's signature proving he knew exactly who he was. I had my grandmother's box on my lap. I had a name and a dollar amount in his careful hand. The wall was going up. But the heart of it wasn't in any file yet. It was in that box. I opened the tin that night at my kitchen table. On top, a letter in my grandmother's looping hand, written weeks before she died, back when I was in nursing school. Eleanor Whitfield had known she was running out of time, and she wrote to the future. She wrote about watching money poison other families she'd known, turn siblings into strangers, and how afraid she was of the same thing happening to ours. Then she wrote a line about my mom that undid me. She knew Diane had felt unloved growing up, that Diane had spent her childhood believing Earl loved the hardware store, the church, the whole town more than his own daughter, and that some of that hurt was real, and some of it was a story she told herself until it hardened into truth. Both kinds of hurt can rot a person from the inside. "Please," Eleanor wrote, "don't let money be the thing that decides who we are to each other." Underneath was the reason all of this existed, the original will and a deed of intention. The house was never meant to be sold. It was meant to fund a nursing scholarship in Eleanor's name, sending young women like me through school the way she'd always dreamed. I sat there a long time with my mother's voice looping in my head. "He won't even remember by Christmas anyway." And I thought, with a calm that surprised me, that he'd remember every Christmas from here on. The doctor had proven it in writing. My grandmother had left the reason in a cookie tin. Now I just had to make sure the town saw it too. Comment Team Earl if this story has you feeling something. Subscribe now, the birthday party is coming and you don't want to miss it. Friday, I filed the formal report with Adult Protective Services, the forwarded mail, the $21,400 in withdrawals with the printout, the added authorized user, the pending power of attorney application, Vanessa Cole and her booked appointment on Grandpa's birthday, the doctor's evaluation. Just facts with dates attached, no opinions, no name-calling. I also called the National Elder Fraud Hotline, and a patient voice walked me through his rights, including the fact that anyone acting as his agent could legally be required to account for every dollar in writing. The caseworker took it seriously, said she'd open an investigation. Then she said the thing I'd been dreading. "These take time, Miss Carter. Realistically, weeks, not days." I told her about the party. The ambush dressed as a celebration. She was honest. She couldn't promise it would wrap before then. The state moves at the state's pace. I drove home understanding the machinery of justice wasn't going to arrive fast enough to save him at that party. If my grandfather was going to be protected, it was going to happen in that living room in front of everyone. And I was going to have to be the one to do it. My mother found out about the doctor's visit. She called Saturday, no honey left in her voice. What do you think you're doing? Taking him behind my back? Do you have any idea how this looks? I told her I knew exactly how it looked. She talked over me, called me a troublemaker, said I was tearing the family apart, that a real daughter would trust her mother. The oldest weapon in her arsenal, aimed at the soft place where I'd always caved. You're hurting the family. Be quiet and everything will be fine. For 32 years that sentence had folded me in half. I waited for the fold. It didn't come. I'm not going to argue with you, Mom, I said, steadier than I'd ever sounded. I love Grandpa and I'm not going to be quiet. She went silent, genuinely stunned because I had never once told her no and meant it. Then she hissed that I'd regret this and hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding a dead phone, heart pounding, and underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt around her in decades. Solid ground. If you've ever finally stopped shrinking yourself for someone who only loved you quiet, tell me below. Subscribe. What she did next was chilling. She moved fast. Within a day, she'd changed the locks on Grandpa's house, for his safety, framing herself as a loving daughter protecting a vulnerable man from a scheming granddaughter. She called relatives with her version. I was the one manipulating him after the house, dragging him to doctors behind everyone's back. By Sunday, 2 cousins wouldn't answer my texts. She screened his calls. For 2 days, I couldn't reach him at all. That silence was the worst part of the whole ordeal. I lay awake imagining him alone with the new locks, wondering if he thought I'd abandoned him. I want to be fair because he taught me to be. One evening I drove past my mom's house and saw her sitting alone in her car in the driveway, hands over her face, really crying, the kind you only do when you're sure no one's watching. Roland's last business venture had quietly collapsed, taking their savings with it. They were closer to losing their own home than any of us knew. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a frightened woman who'd convinced herself that taking her father's house early was just claiming what would be hers anyway. I felt a pull of pity. Then I remembered his voice asking about the tomato garden, and her saying he wouldn't remember it by Christmas. Pity found its proper size. Frightened doesn't mean forgiven. I got to him through the one door my mother couldn't shut, my own profession. My friend Renee ran a legitimate home health service with real credentials and every right to check on an elderly client. Grandpa requested a wellness visit himself, which was entirely his right, and my mother couldn't refuse it without looking exactly like what she was. Renee called me afterward from her car. He was fine, steady, sharp, more clear-eyed than half her clients. And he'd sent a message through her. He'd already anticipated the isolation. Before the locks changed, he'd quietly signed a limited legal authorization with Margaret, freely on record with an independent witness, giving her standing to act on the money issues. Not a power of attorney handing away his life. The opposite, a narrow, limited document that protected his accounts while he stayed fully in charge of himself. He'd built his own countermove while I was building mine. I'd spent this whole time thinking I was rescuing him. Truth was closer to a partnership. He wasn't a helpless old man. He was a competent one who'd chosen his ally, gathered his documents, set his timing, and trusted me to be the face of it when the moment came. Renee passed along one more line, pure Earl. Tell Melanie not to worry about the party. Tell her to let them bring their papers. I sat in that parking lot and laughed for the first time in a week. He wasn't hiding anymore. Neither was I. What happened next is the whole reason I keep coming back to this story. Nobody swooped in to save us. We built it ourselves, and I'm about to show you exactly how. Over the next week, the pieces came together and none of it fell from the sky. Everyone who stood with my grandfather was someone one of us had gone out and found on purpose with effort. Margaret, ready with the paper trail. Dr. Nguyen, whose evaluation sat in my bag like a shield. The APS caseworker, whose open investigation gave it weight. Renee, who could speak to his real condition as a professional. Margaret gave me the single most important piece of advice I got through the whole ordeal. You can't just accuse your mother. Becomes your word against hers, and half the room looks away. Let her show them herself. Let her produce the papers. Let her make her whole pitch. Then, once she's committed in front of everyone, put the truth on the table. Facts, not feelings. Her power was performance. So we'd let her perform all the way to the edge, then answer performance with proof. I asked if she'd come to the party. She smiled. I wouldn't miss it. That night I called Grandpa, and for the first time since it started I heard him laugh, a real one. Let them light the candles. Let them sing. And then, Melly, let's blow the whole thing out. 6 days left. I spent them assembling a folder, plain manila, built the way I'd build a case in a family meeting where the stakes were someone's whole life. On top, Dr. Nguyen's evaluation. Behind it, the bank printout, the $21,400 highlighted, Roland's added authorization. Behind that, the APS confirmation letter. Then Vanessa Cole's lack of license, her commission structure, her booked appointment. And at the very back, the two things that mattered most, my grandmother's letter and the original will, the house pledged to a nursing scholarship in Eleanor's name. I thought about recording the party secretly and decided against it. It would have been the easy move, but it would have made this a gotcha instead of a stand for the truth. My grandfather chose the honest road at every step. I do the same. Everything in that folder was real, obtained the right way, able to stand in any room, any court. That was the whole difference between us and them. They dealt in what things looked like. We dealt in what things were. Smash subscribe now if you haven't. We're 2 days out from the birthday party, and it does not go the way anybody in that room expects. 2 days before the party, I learned the rest of their plan. Vanessa had gotten careless with her scheduling, and my cousin Katie told me what my mom had been saying in a family group chat I'd apparently been quietly removed from. The party, right after cake, my mother would gather everyone, give a speech about how hard this was for her, how much she loved her father, how his memory was failing. Then, gently, in front of Pastor Dan and the neighbors and the whole family, she'd invite him to sign the power of attorney for transparency, so everyone can see it's his choice. Vanessa would stand ready with the pen. The audience wasn't an accident, it was the strategy. 40 witnesses watching a devoted daughter help her confused father sign a paper meant 40 people who'd later swear it looked perfectly loving. She was lining up her own witnesses for a crime. She'd thought through the guest list, Pastor Dan, Grandpa's oldest neighbors, people whose word carried weight in Millhaven. I sat with that, and instead of fear, I felt something click clear. She'd built a room full of witnesses to bless her. Fine. A room full of witnesses cuts both ways. She was about to make her case in front of the exact people who most needed to hear the truth. She thought she'd loaded the room in her favor. She'd actually just gathered my jury. The night before, I talked to Grandpa for a long time. We went over what would happen, who would say what, when I'd open the folder. He told me the hardest part, the deciding, was already behind us. You remember what I told you that day? Hide. Right now. I'll never forget it. That was the last time you'll ever need to hide from your mother, he said. Tomorrow you don't hide. Tomorrow you stand right where everyone can see you. Then he told me one more thing that made me nervous and proud at once. He was going to play the fog one final time, let my mom commit all the way, say every damning thing in front of every guest before he dropped the act. I need her to show them who she is before she finds out who I am. He admitted it was a risk. If anything went sideways, we could lose everything. But it was his call, his house, and he'd earned the right to end it his way. One last performance, he said. Then no more pretending, Melly. For either of us. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think he did either. This is it, the party is next. Comment ready if you're strapped in and don't skip ahead. Party looked like love. That was the awful part. My key didn't even work anymore. The locks had been changed, so I had to be walked in like a guest. 80 gold balloons across the ceiling, a sheet cake with his name in blue frosting, neighbors laughing, Pastor Dan at the door. My mother, radiant, in the middle of it, playing the role of her life. The devoted daughter, murmuring about how hard it was to watch her father decline, how blessed she felt to care for him. It was a performance so smooth it turned my stomach because I finally understood what it was for. Not the house, not even the money. This, the image. The good daughter, admired by the whole town. Roland stood by the wall with an untouched drink, watching the door. Near the hallway stood Vanessa Cole in a sharp blazer, leather case under her arm, waiting for her cue. Grandpa sat in his chair by the window, small and vague, letting a neighbor pat his hand. He didn't look at me. Deep in character. I found a spot near the fireplace, my folder held tight against my side, and made myself breathe. Then my mother tapped a fork against her wine glass, and the room quieted. "Everyone," she said, "I have an announcement about Dad. If you're still with me, drop your city and the time where you're watching." Deep breath. Here we go. She was wonderful, I'll give her that. Tears gathering right on cue, she told the story she'd perfected, how Dad had been struggling, forgetting things, couldn't manage his affairs anymore, how it broke her heart but somebody had to protect him. She said she'd found a wonderful consultant. Vanessa stepped forward with the leather case and a warm smile. "So today," my mom said, "with all of you here, our family, Dad's going to sign over financial power of attorney to me, right out in the open so everyone can see it's completely his own wish." Masterful. A robbery wrapped in the language of transparency. Vanessa uncapped her pen. Grandpa looked up with damp, confused eyes and asked if it was almost time for cake. The room laughed gently, falling a little more in love with the story of the poor confused old man and his devoted daughter. "Just here, Earl." "Right on the line." My mother beamed. Roland leaned forward. This was the moment, everything pointed at this one signature in front of these exact witnesses. I set my drink down and stepped into the middle of the floor. "Before Grandpa signs anything," I said, "I think everyone here should hear a few things first." Level. Not loud. Years of speaking calmly in rooms full of frightened families held. The whole room turned. My mother's smile stayed frozen, her eyes flat. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time. You said you wanted this done in the open." "Good. Let's do it in the open." I felt the room sharpen, that shift when a polite scene turns real. Vanessa paused, pen hovering. Roland's jaw tightened. My mother stepped toward me, dropping her voice to that private, cutting tone. "You are embarrassing yourself." "Sit down." The old reflex flickered, the pull to fold to smooth it over. I looked past her to my grandfather. The fog was already thinning in his eyes. I looked back at my mother. I did not sit down. "I'm a nurse, Mom," I said, calm as still water. "I take care of people Grandpa's age every day, and I know exactly what it looks like when someone perfectly healthy gets treated like they're already gone." I turned to the room, to Pastor Dan, the neighbors, the cousins. "You all came here to celebrate his 80th birthday. Before anybody signs away his life, you deserve to know who he really is, and what's actually been happening in this house." Quieter I got, the more they leaned in. My mother had built her whole plan on being the only one talking. I'd just taken the floor. I laid it out one page at a time. "This is a full cognitive evaluation done 3 days ago by Dr. Nguyen, a geriatric specialist. Says my grandfather is completely competent. Sharp memory. Sound judgment." A murmur rolled through the room. Her whole story rested on one claim, and I'd just put a doctor's signature through the heart of it. This is his bank record from the last 3 months. $21,400 in withdrawals he never made. And here, the paperwork adding Roland as an authorized user, notarized by that woman right there. I nodded at Vanessa, who'd gone still. "This is a letter from Adult Protective Services, confirming they've opened an investigation into the financial abuse of Earl Whitfield." The word abuse landed like a dropped plate. Pastor Dan straightened. Neighbors exchanged worried looks. And this woman with the pen is Vanessa Cole. Not a lawyer. Not a social worker. A notary who gets paid a commission for every elderly person she gets to sign fast, before their families can object. She has an appointment booked for this exact afternoon. On his birthday. I never raised my voice. I never called my mother a thief. I just kept setting true things on the table until the warm story fell apart in front of the very witnesses she'd gathered to bless it. Vanessa capped her pen and slid the leather case off the table. The neighbors weren't looking at the confused old man anymore. They were looking at my mother, who had started to breathe fast. Vanessa tried to save herself first. Everything I do is completely legal. The family requested my services. There's nothing legal about rushing a competent man into signing away his entire life, said a new voice from the doorway. Margaret Kilbride stepped in, calm and in no hurry at all, filling the room with every ounce of lawyer instinct she owned. I'm Mr. Whitfield's attorney. He granted me limited authority 2 weeks ago, freely with an independent witness, precisely because he knew this was coming. Ms. Cole, you may want to speak to your own attorney before you say another word. Vanessa's mouth closed. She picked up her leather case and walked straight out. Then every eye turned to Roland, confidence drained, looking small and cornered. The $21,000 went into an account you're listed on, Roland, I said quietly. Your business closed last spring. You're behind on your own mortgage. He opened his mouth, found nothing, shut it again. In 5 minutes, their whole setup folded and went quiet because none of it could survive daylight. Only my mother was left standing alone, and the whole town was watching her. Then my grandfather stood, the way a judge rises, not a frail old man. The fog was gone from his face, and every person in the room saw the difference happen in real time. I'd like to say something at my own party. His voice carried without rising. The room went silent. I'm not confused. I haven't been for months. I've known exactly what my daughter and her husband were planning, and I let them think I was slipping so they'd show me the whole plan instead of one piece at a time. I asked my granddaughter to hide in my hallway the day they first came with those papers, so she could hear it with her own ears and believe it. Everything she just showed you is true. I am sound of mind. Dr. Nguyen will confirm every word. And nothing gets signed in this house today. A neighbor let out a breath, half laugh, half relief. Grandpa turned to me, and for a second the accountant softened back into the grandfather who used to save me the corner piece of cake. Then he looked at his daughter. I stepped up beside him. No one signs anything today, Mom. It's over. That was when my mother finally broke. All the polish cracked and fell away. What came out was raw and ugly. You have no idea what I have given up for this family, she shouted. 40 years I stood in his shadow while he poured everything into that hardware store. The church, complete strangers, and I got nothing. She jabbed a finger at us. And now you all judge me when I'm the only one who ever, her voice cracked. You're all against me. The villain was no longer a confused old man being robbed. It was a shouting woman, spitting blame at her own father on his 80th birthday, in front of the pastor she'd invited to lend her credibility. The louder she got, the smaller she became. I stayed quiet. I didn't shout back. I didn't need to. Every word out of her mouth proved everything I'd just put on the table, and the whole town was watching her prove it. When she finally ran out of breath, shaking, mascara streaked, the silence that followed was the loudest sound in the house. Hide. Right now, I said gently. She stared, not understanding. That's what Grandpa told me the day you came for his house. I hid and I heard everything. I'm not hiding anymore. And neither is he. She had no answer. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say to me. I pulled Dr. Nguyen's evaluation back out, held it up. Not a weapon anymore, just a fact. You told them he wouldn't remember this by Christmas, I said, quiet enough the room had to hold its breath. You said it like it didn't matter. I set it down in front of her. He's going to remember this Christmas. And every one after it. She looked at the paper, at her father standing tall and clear-eyed beside me, and something in her finally understood it was over. Pastor Dan stepped forward and gently led her toward the door, past the balloons, past the untouched cake, past neighbors who wouldn't meet her eyes. Roland had already slipped out. To threshold, she stopped and looked back once at her father. I don't know what she hoped to see. Whatever it was, she didn't find it. The door clicked shut, and the house my grandfather built was quiet again. And his again. He let out a long breath, shoulders finally dropping. Well, he said, the faintest dry smile breaking through, who wants some cake? And somehow, impossibly, people laughed. Party breathed again. If you got Chill's comic cake, you earned it. The weeks after were quieter than you'd think because truth, once it's out, doesn't need much noise. Adult Protective Services confirmed everything our folder showed. The pending power of attorney was killed before it could take effect. With Margaret's help, most of the $21,400 was traced and recovered. Vanessa Cole was reported to the state and to her licensing board. I later heard she'd stopped taking new clients anywhere in the county. Roland, with the business gone and the easy money gone with it, didn't stick around long. My mother was never arrested. Grandpa could have pressed charges. Margaret said the case was solid. He decided against it. She's still my daughter, he told me. I don't want her in a cell. I want her out of my accounts. So that's what he got. She lost every ounce of access to his money, and she lost the image she'd spent a lifetime building because Millhaven is a small town, and everyone at that party had a mouth. The devoted daughter became the woman who tried to rob her own father at his 80th birthday party, a consequence she handed to herself. My grandfather stayed in his house, in his garden, with his real key back in his own pocket. We set up the Eleanor Whitfield Nursing Scholarship, funded exactly the way she dreamed, sending young women through nursing school in her name. He asked me to help run it, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. Something in that living room changed the direction of my life. I walked in a nurse who'd spent 32 years folding herself in half to keep the peace. I walked out understanding that staying quiet had never once kept anybody safe. I started volunteering with a local elder rights group, sitting beside frightened older people with the folder full of facts I'd had to become for my own grandfather. The thing I'd been most ashamed of, my need to carry weight that isn't mine, turned out to be exactly the right tool once I pointed it at people who actually needed carrying. My grandmother had wanted that house to send nurses to school. In the end, it sent me somewhere too. If there's one thing I learned crouched behind that closet and standing in that living room 3 weeks later, it's this. Protecting the people who raised us isn't betrayal. Staying silent while they're robbed, that's the real betrayal. That's how one whisper in a hallway turned into a granddaughter standing her ground, a quiet old man playing the longest game of his life, and a birthday party that ended up saving a home instead of losing one. If someone you love is being pushed to sign something they don't understand, don't wait like I almost did. The hard questions. Keep records. Make the call even if your hands are shaking. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, hit like so it reaches another family who needs it before it's too late. Share it with someone who needs to see it today. And subscribe to Silent Revenge because there's a lot more where this came from. Before you go, drop your city and the time where you're watching right now. I read every one and I love seeing how far this story travels. Have you ever had to stand up to your own family to protect someone you love? Tell me below. I'll see you in the next one.